In the closing years of the 19th century, Salem, Massachusetts still carried the image of a quiet, orderly seaport town. Yet, beyond the edges of its brick-lined streets, St. Mary Sanatorium operated under a veil of secrecy. Established as a charitable institution for the treatment of chronic illnesses, it maintained a reputation for meticulous care and moral discipline. What the public never learned was that its official records were not the only documents kept within its walls. Hidden in locked drawers and private cabinets, a series of handwritten diaries chronicled daily life inside the sanatorium, recorded not by administrators, but by staff and patients whose perspectives were never intended for public view. St. Mary Sanatorium, founded in 1889 by a coalition of civic leaders and local benefactors, was widely considered one of the most modern medical facilities in Essex County. Its brick main building, with tall arched windows and orderly gardens, stood as a visible emblem of progress. Physicians and matrons spoke proudly of its regimented routines, cleanliness and moral oversight, promoting it as a model for similar institutions across New England. Local newspapers regularly printed accounts of its charitable work, reinforcing an image of dedication and virtue. Yet these accounts relied entirely on official statements, ignoring the experiences of those living and working behind the sanatorium's doors. The rediscovery of the private diaries decades later would quietly contradict the carefully managed public image, revealing aspects of its operations never acknowledged in the official narrative. The public knew St. Mary Sanatorium for its measured order, but for those who entered its grounds, the first impression was often shaped by its architecture. The main building rose 3 stories above a slope that faced the road, its brickwork pale from years of coastal wind. Wide front steps led to a set of oak doors, polished to a soft sheen, and flanked by columns whose stone capitals bore simple floral carvings. At the far edges of the property, smaller auxiliary buildings housed the kitchen, laundry, and staff quarters. These secondary structures were connected to the main building by gravel paths that passed through cultivated lawns and small garden beds. The arrangement projected symmetry and planning, a visible assurance of control and stability. Inside, the central hall was brightly lit by tall windows. Floors of polished maple reflected the light, and the air carried the faint scent of lavender from the daily cleaning solution. A reception desk stood opposite the entrance, with a registry book placed prominently for visitors to sign. Beyond the desk, double doors opened to a corridor leading toward patient wards on the left and administrative offices on the right. The institution's sense of order extended even to the soundscape. Conversations were muted, footsteps deliberate, and all activity paced according to the appointed schedule. The sanatorium's leadership was headed by Superintendent Charles E. Latham, a physician known for his preference for precise documentation. He kept an office near the main entrance, where an assortment of medical texts lined the walls beside framed commendations from local civic groups. Latham's approach to management was direct. He expected staff to record every detail of patient care in the official ledgers, from temperature readings to mealtime attendance. To his peers, this meticulousness was a sign of efficiency. To those under his supervision, it was a constant reminder that nothing within the sanatorium occurred without oversight. The nursing staff, most of whom lived in the adjoining quarters, were trained to maintain the sanatorium's routines with exact adherence. Uniforms were pressed daily. Ward rounds followed a fixed circuit at the same times each morning and evening. Sheets were changed according to a weekly plan, and personal items were kept in designated cabinets. In the public view, these measures were held up as examples of high standards. Internally, however, they created an atmosphere where deviation from procedure was noted instantly and questioned. Public tours of the facility were occasionally permitted. On such occasions, select areas were prepared in advance. Wards were aired and tidied, flower arrangements placed on windowsills, and dining areas set with polished cutlery. Visitors were escorted along pre-planned routes, avoiding less presentable sections. These visits often ended in the common hall, where pamphlets were distributed describing the sanatorium's mission and citing the number of patients served since its founding. Guests left with the impression of a well-ordered, humane environment. This was the image that appeared in the press and in speeches delivered at civic meetings. Yet for the staff who lived on site year-round, the work involved more than the prepared scenes shown to the public. The patient population was diverse in age, background, and condition. Managing daily care for so many required constant coordination among attendants, nurses, and the kitchen, laundry, and maintenance crews. Schedules had to be adjusted when new admissions arrived unexpectedly. Supplies were ordered according to strict budgetary limits, requiring staff to account for every item used. The official reports made this sound like an efficient system of resource management, but in practice, shortages were frequent and substitutions became routine. St. Mary Sanatorium maintained a reputation for charitable service, but funding was dependent on both private donations and municipal allocations. The Board of Trustees, composed of local businessmen and clergy, reviewed budgets quarterly. Their primary concern was that the institution continue to demonstrate its value to the town without exceeding its allotted resources. This focus on financial prudence shaped many internal decisions, from the hiring of staff to the kinds of treatments that could be offered. While no one publicly questioned the institution's commitment to care, the limitations imposed by the budget influenced daily operations in ways that were not part of the official narrative. The diaries later discovered would indicate that several staff members kept private accounts of their duties, recording details not found in the ledgers. The tone of these writings varied. Some reflected a genuine pride in maintaining order under challenging circumstances. Others hinted at quiet frustration over policies they felt interfered with patient well-being. These personal records were not shared outside the building, and their existence was not acknowledged during the years of the sanatorium's operation. They remained in locked trunks or in drawers in staff quarters, unnoticed by those who focused only on official records. Patients were admitted to St. Mary Sanatorium by physician referral or, in some cases, by petition from family members. Admissions followed a formal procedure. Applicants were reviewed by the superintendent and a small committee who examined medical history and determined whether the institution could provide suitable care. Once accepted, patients were assigned to one of the wards according to their condition and needs. Wards were supervised by a head nurse who reported directly to the superintendent. Each morning began with a series of routine checks, followed by scheduled activities such as reading, light exercise, or work in the garden for those able to participate. The gardens served multiple purposes. They provided vegetables and herbs for the kitchen, offered patients an outdoor environment, and gave the institution an appearance of self-sufficiency. Staff assigned to the gardens rotated through duties, sometimes working alongside patients. Official accounts describe these activities as part of a therapeutic regimen, but the diaries suggest they were also a practical means of supplementing the food supply when budget allocations were tight. Within the community, St. Mary Sanatorium was regarded with a mix of pride and distance. Many residents admired its mission, but had little direct contact with the facility. The building's location on the edge of town kept it physically separate from daily life, and most locals interacted with it only through newspaper reports or annual fundraising events. At such events, the superintendent and trustees spoke about the institution's achievements, often citing the number of patients served and the improvements made to the building or grounds. These presentations reinforced the narrative of efficiency and benevolence, leaving little room for alternative perspectives. Inside the sanatorium, communication between departments was methodical but constrained. Meetings were held in the superintendent's office, where reports were delivered and instructions issued. Staff followed established channels, with nurses reporting to their head nurse, attendants to their supervisor, and all matters ultimately reaching the superintendent. This structure ensured that information moved in an orderly fashion, but it also meant that certain concerns could be redirected or set aside before reaching the highest level. The role of the Board of Trustees extended beyond financial oversight. Trustees occasionally visited unannounced, walking through selected areas of the building to observe operations. Their visits were brief, and their attention focused primarily on cleanliness and order. When they encountered staff, they offered polite conversation, but rarely asked detailed questions about daily procedures. Their primary interest was in maintaining the institution's public image, ensuring that any report they gave to the community reflected stability and success. The official archives of St. Mary Sanatorium, maintained in the superintendent's office, contained admission registers, treatment logs, supply inventories, and correspondence with donors and municipal authorities. These documents formed the basis for public reports and were preserved with care. The diaries, by contrast, were informal and personal, lacking the structure and formality of the official records. They provided observations on schedules, supply conditions, interpersonal relations among staff, and occasional comments on policy decisions. None of these entries contradicted the institution's stated mission outright, but they offered a more layered view of life within its walls, one not visible in the carefully curated public image. The daily schedule at St. Mary Sanatorium was governed by the striking of a small brass bell, positioned in the main hall near the stairwell. The first bell of the morning sounded at 6 o'clock, signaling the start of the day for both patients and staff. Attendants moved through the wards with quiet efficiency, drawing curtains, opening windows, and assisting with preparations for the morning round. The rhythm was so constant that those who had been there for even a short time could anticipate each transition without consulting the posted timetable. Meals were served in a large dining hall at the rear of the building. Long wooden tables, arranged in precise rows, were set before the first seating began. The kitchen occupied an adjoining wing, with a staff led by Mrs. Agatha Rowe, a matron with a reputation for exacting standards in both food preparation and storage. Ingredients were catalogued upon arrival, checked against supply records, and stored in a pantry where each shelf bore a hand-lettered tag. The kitchen staff worked in shifts, starting before dawn to prepare breakfast and continuing throughout the day to accommodate the fixed schedule of 3 meals and 2 light refreshments. To visitors, the dining hall projected an air of simplicity and order. To the staff who managed it, the process was an intricate balancing act. Menus were influenced by both nutritional considerations and the realities of the budget. The official records noted the quantities served, but the diaries occasionally revealed how adjustments were made when certain items ran low. For instance, a planned midday dish might be altered without notice if a shipment from the market was delayed, or if donations failed to arrive as expected. Such changes were discreet and seldom discussed outside the kitchen. Beyond the formal wards, St. Mary Sanatorium included several small rooms designated for quiet activities. These rooms contained shelves of books, tables for writing, and in one corner a piano maintained in working order by a local craftsman. Staff were encouraged to bring patients here during scheduled recreation times, and official reports described these activities as an integral part of the therapeutic program. In practice, attendance varied depending on staffing levels and the demands of the day. The diaries suggest that while these rooms were appreciated by some, others preferred to remain in the gardens or by their ward windows. The gardens themselves were among the sanatorium's most distinctive features. Enclosed on 3 sides by brick walls, and on the 4th by a row of mature elms, they provided a sheltered environment for cultivation. Rows of vegetables were interspersed with plots of flowers, and narrow gravel paths allowed for easy access. Garden work was overseen by Mr. Tobias Kent, a long-serving groundskeeper known for his steady manner. His notes, preserved in the diaries of another staff member, indicate that crop yields were closely monitored and often factored into meal planning for the following week. In addition to supplying the kitchen, the gardens served a public relations role. On certain summer days, local visitors were invited to tour them, reinforcing the image of self-reliance. Staff quarters were located in a separate wing, connected to the main building by a covered passage. These rooms were modest but functional, each containing a narrow bed, a small desk, and a wardrobe. Life in the quarters followed its own routine, shaped by the varying schedules of day and night shifts. The diaries mention the quiet companionship that developed among long-term staff, with shared meals in the common room and informal discussions after evening duties were completed. Occasionally, a member of staff might take on extra duties to cover for another, though such arrangements were made privately and were not reflected in the official duty roster. One of the more formal spaces in the sanatorium was the assembly room, used for lectures, trustee meetings, and occasional community events. This room, with its high ceiling and rows of wooden chairs, was designed to accommodate both staff and visiting dignitaries. When used for public events, the assembly room was arranged with banners, tables for refreshments and displays highlighting the institution's achievements. These events were documented in the local press, often accompanied by photographs that showed the superintendent addressing attendees or standing beside a trustee near the podium. The administrative wing housed the superintendent's office, a clerk's room, and a small archive. The clerk's room contained the ledgers in which all official transactions were recorded. Entries were made daily, covering patient admissions, discharges, supply deliveries, and correspondence. These records were maintained with precision as they formed the basis for quarterly reports submitted to the Board of Trustees. The diaries indicate that not all daily occurrences were captured in these ledgers, particularly those related to minor operational adjustments or interpersonal matters among staff. Such omissions were not the result of deliberate concealment, but rather the institutional focus on measurable data. Interactions between patients and staff followed patterns set by routine. Each nurse was responsible for a defined set of rooms, ensuring familiarity with the individuals under their care. Conversations were often brief, centered on the practicalities of the day, yet familiarity over time allowed for a quiet rapport to develop. While the official reports emphasized medical progress and compliance with treatment plans, the diaries recorded moments of ordinary interaction that fell outside formal duties. These included remarks about the weather, shared observations from the gardens, or the exchange of books from the common shelves. The supply system operated on a strict timetable. Deliveries from the town arrived twice a week, typically on Tuesday and Friday mornings. A covered cart would stop at the rear entrance, where attendants checked items against the order list. Any discrepancies were noted and reported to the clerk, who adjusted the inventory accordingly. The diaries reveal that staff occasionally supplemented these deliveries with purchases made during their own time, especially if certain goods were not available through the regular suppliers. These purchases were never entered into the official records, but were nonetheless used within the institution. Relations between the sanatorium and the wider community were managed carefully. Letters of thanks were sent to donors, sometimes accompanied by formal invitations to visit. When prominent visitors arrived, the superintendent ensured that they toured only the most orderly areas. These tours were designed to leave a lasting impression, reinforcing the narrative of a disciplined and compassionate institution. The diaries suggest that these visits required considerable preparation, with additional cleaning and adjustments to daily schedules in order to present the desired image. The atmosphere of St. Mary Sanatorium was shaped by its blend of formality and quiet persistence. Staff were aware that their work contributed to the institution's reputation as much as the superintendent's speeches or the trustees' reports. The sense of continuity was reinforced by traditions such as the annual midsummer gathering in the gardens, during which staff and select patients took part in arranging floral displays. These events were not only a break from routine, but also a reminder of the public face the institution sought to maintain. By the final years of the 19th century, the sanatorium had become firmly established in the local consciousness. The building was a familiar sight to residents, the name frequently mentioned in civic reports, and the superintendent standing in the community assured. Yet behind the oak doors and polished floors, the daily reality was a complex balance of resources, responsibilities, and quiet adaptation to circumstances that could not be captured fully in official statements. The diaries that would one day be found did not dispute the institution's stated mission, but they recorded details that spoke to the daily realities of maintaining such a place, details that had never been intended for public reading. By the middle of its first decade of operation, St. Mary Sanatorium had reached a point where its systems functioned with the predictability of a clock. Yet within this order, there were moments when staff began to notice small irregularities that, while not alarming in themselves, created quiet discussion in the private spaces of the institution. These irregularities were not breaches of conduct or failures in duty, but subtle patterns that hinted at conditions beneath the polished exterior. One of the earliest points of observation came from the storage records. The official ledgers kept with precision in the clerk's room reflected steady consumption of provisions. Deliveries arrived on schedule and were signed for without issue. However, entries in one of the private diaries noted that certain items, particularly medical supplies, seem to require reordering more often than their documented rate of use would suggest. This was not a matter of shortage affecting patient care, but it did prompt quiet speculation among those who had reason to consult both the official records and their own day-to-day experience. In the gardens, a similar form of pattern recognition emerged. Tobias Kent, the groundskeeper, kept a small notebook in which he tracked planting schedules and harvest yields. According to the official reports, the garden output was steady year to year, contributing predictably to the kitchen's needs. Yet Kent's notes, later found in the belongings of another staff member, showed fluctuations in yield that were not reflected in the public accounts. These were not drastic differences, but enough to suggest that either the produce was being used in ways not documented or that some harvests were diverted elsewhere before reaching the kitchen stores. The operation of the laundry also revealed occasional inconsistencies. Laundry staff were responsible for tracking the number of linens, uniforms, and garments processed each week. Officially, these numbers remained within a consistent range, reflecting a steady turnover of clean bedding and clothing. In practice, however, a few staff members observed that the quantity of items returned from the laundry did not always match the number sent for cleaning. Sometimes this discrepancy was resolved within days, when misplaced items resurfaced in storage rooms. At other times, the missing items were quietly replaced without entry in the inventory, creating small but recurring gaps between recorded and actual stock. These were not matters that reached the attention of the Board of Trustees or even the superintendent in any formal way. They were instead part of the informal awareness that existed among long-serving staff, those who understood the difference between official procedure and practical reality. In the diaries, such observations were rarely framed as accusations. Rather, they were recorded as part of a broader awareness that what was presented publicly was only one version of the sanatorium's daily operations. In the wards, a different kind of irregularity was noticed. Patients were assigned schedules for activities, meals, and rest, designed to provide structure and consistency. These schedules were adjusted by the head nurse based on medical assessments. In the official records, the schedules appeared stable, with minor changes documented in monthly reports. Yet attendants occasionally found that certain patients were absent from scheduled activities without an official reason given. When asked, the head nurse would sometimes respond with a brief note that the individual was otherwise occupied or engaged in restorative rest. In the diaries, such entries were recorded without speculation, but the pattern of these absences was noted by more than one observer. The assembly room, when not in use for public functions, served as a meeting space for staff discussions. Here, informal conversations sometimes touched on these patterns, though never in a way that implied misconduct. Rather, they were framed as curiosities, the kind of operational anomalies that arise in any institution over time. Still, the fact that multiple staff members noticed similar discrepancies in different areas suggested that they were not entirely isolated occurrences. Communication within the administrative wing followed a clear hierarchy. Instructions flowed downward from the superintendent through department heads, while reports moved upward through the same channels. This structure was effective in maintaining order, but it also meant that certain observations made by staff might not reach higher levels unless a department head chose to include them in a formal report. In some cases, these observations remained within the level where they originated, known only to those directly involved. The kitchen provided another example of how subtle irregularities could emerge unnoticed by the wider institution. Meal preparation required precise measurement of ingredients, both for consistency and to manage supply levels. While the official records accounted for the quantities used in each dish, the diaries noted instances where a planned menu was altered due to unavailable ingredients, despite those items being marked as in stock in the ledger. In such cases, the kitchen staff would improvise, ensuring that the meal met nutritional guidelines, but the substitution was rarely entered into the official record. Interactions with outside vendors formed an important part of the sanatorium's operations. Deliveries of coal for heating, medical supplies and foodstuffs arrived according to contracts negotiated by the board. Official correspondence regarding these transactions was preserved in the archives, demonstrating careful attention to cost and timeliness. Yet the diaries suggest that, on occasion, deliveries arrived later than scheduled or in smaller quantities than ordered, requiring adjustments within the institution to accommodate the shortfall. These incidents were managed quietly and without public acknowledgement, reflecting an internal priority on maintaining the appearance of uninterrupted operations. Over time, these minor irregularities formed a pattern recognized by those who paid close attention to the daily flow of resources and activities. They did not disrupt the institution's core functions, nor did they contradict its stated mission. Still, they revealed the extent to which the official image of the sanatorium depended on a smooth, unbroken narrative. The diaries, with their fragmented notes and personal observations, offered a parallel record in which these small divergences were acknowledged, even if their cause remained uncertain. One particular diary, kept by a nurse who served in the West Wing, contained a series of entries about changes in the ward's supply of bedding. According to her notes, new bedding was delivered to the ward less frequently than to other sections, despite identical schedules in the official supply plan. She did not attribute this to neglect or favoritism, but simply recorded it as an ongoing observation, noting each time the discrepancy occurred. The pattern was not large enough to cause operational difficulty, yet it persisted over several months, suggesting that the official supply distribution was more flexible in practice than in policy. The maintenance department, responsible for repairs and upkeep, operated under its own set of challenges. Led by a foreman named Albert Trask, the team managed everything from replacing broken window panes to repairing furniture. Officially, maintenance reports listed each repair in chronological order, with notes on the materials used. In practice, Trask sometimes prioritized repairs differently from the official schedule, addressing issues he deemed more urgent, even if they had not yet been entered into the request log. This approach kept essential operations running smoothly, but occasionally created small discrepancies between the official repair records and the actual work performed. The relationship between these various irregularities was never formally investigated during the years in question. They existed as part of the undercurrent of institutional life, acknowledged privately but rarely, if ever, entered into the official record. In the public narrative, St. Mary's Sanatorium continued to stand as a model of order and reliability. In the diaries, however, the presence of these patterns suggested that the reality of daily operations was more fluid, shaped by quiet adjustments and accommodations that allowed the institution to maintain its outward image while managing the unpredictable demands of its inner workings. Seasonal changes brought their own set of irregularities to the operations of St. Mary's Sanatorium. Winter, in particular, tested the efficiency of the institution's routines. The delivery of coal for heating was a critical matter, and while official records showed uninterrupted supply, the diaries indicated that deliveries sometimes arrived later than planned during periods of heavy snow. In such cases, the maintenance department worked quietly to manage consumption, adjusting the heating schedule in certain areas without making formal note of it. These adjustments ensured that the wards remained comfortable, but the process of rationing was not something the administration disclosed publicly. Spring brought a different set of challenges. The gardens, which were an important visual and practical asset, required significant labor to prepare after the frost. Official reports described this as a smooth annual process, but the diaries noted that it often drew staff away from other duties for days at a time. Tobias Kent's planting schedule was followed closely, yet when unexpected frosts damaged early seedlings, replacements had to be purchased from the town market. Such purchases, made in cash and not through the institution's regular accounts, never appeared in the official supply records. The interaction between staff and outside contractors occasionally revealed other small discrepancies. For instance, carpenters or painters hired for repairs were recorded in the official books with exact dates of service. However, diary entries suggest that some tradesmen completed additional small tasks during their visits that were not listed in the contract. These were often minor improvements, like reinforcing shelving in the storage rooms or repairing loose stair treads, but they contributed to the overall upkeep of the building. Because they fell outside the agreed work, They were absent from both the expense records and the repair logs, leaving a gap between what was documented and what was actually done. The flow of correspondence through the administrative office was another point where irregularities became evident. Letters from donors, families, and civic leaders were logged and answered promptly, forming part of the sanatorium's public-facing record. Yet a small number of letters mentioned in diary entries were received and acknowledged without formal logging. These letters might contain specific requests or observations, and while the superintendent responded to them personally, their absence from the archive meant that future reviews of the institution's communication record would show no trace of them. Among the staff, certain patterns in work assignments also drew quiet attention. The duty rosters were posted weekly and showed a fair distribution of responsibilities. However, diary notes indicate that some attendants were repeatedly assigned to particular wards outside their usual rotation, often at short notice. No formal explanation was given, and in many cases the reassignment lasted only a few days. These adjustments may have been made to cover for illness or personal leave, yet their irregularity stood out to those who compared the posted rosters with actual daily practice. The institution's storerooms provided another example of small variations between official records and daily reality. Inventory checks were scheduled monthly, with results entered into the ledgers. According to the diaries, informal checks sometimes occurred in between these scheduled counts, particularly if a staff member noticed a certain item being used more quickly than expected. These unscheduled reviews were not intended to bypass procedure, but served as a practical measure to ensure adequate supply. Still, their results were usually discussed verbally rather than recorded, which meant that they left no trace in the official record. Even the scheduling of the assembly room revealed subtle differences between policy and practice. Publicly, the room was reserved for planned events, lectures, and trustee meetings, all of which were announced in advance. The diaries show that at times it was used for unscheduled gatherings, such as impromptu staff discussions or small instructional sessions. These informal uses did not disrupt the official schedule, but remained undocumented, existing only in the recollections of those present. The procurement of fresh produce from the town market illustrated how practical decisions sometimes diverged from established procedure. Officially, all purchases were to be made through approved suppliers. Yet diary entries describe occasions when staff, noticing a shortage of a particular fruit or vegetable, purchased it directly from a local stall during their time off and brought it back to the kitchen. These contributions were made quietly, without expectation of reimbursement, but they contributed to the seamless continuation of daily meals in a way that the official budget reports could not reflect. There were also moments when patient activities shifted in ways not noted in the official schedule. For example, the diaries mention instances in which scheduled reading sessions in the common rooms were replaced with outdoor walks if the weather was unusually favorable. These changes were not formally recorded because they did not affect the overall therapeutic plan. Yet they altered the daily rhythm in ways that would have been invisible to anyone reviewing the monthly reports. The maintenance of equipment provided yet another area where the official narrative and daily practice diverged slightly. The sanatorium possessed several pieces of specialized medical apparatus, each logged with maintenance dates in the official records. Diary notes, however, indicate that some minor adjustments and repairs were carried out by staff between the scheduled servicing dates. These actions, intended to keep the equipment functioning smoothly, were not considered significant enough to warrant official entry, but were essential to uninterrupted operation. Interactions with the Board of Trustees occasionally created situations where preparation and presentation differed from ongoing reality. Prior to an unannounced visit, there would be a noticeable increase in activity, with additional cleaning and rearrangement of certain rooms. This was not to conceal deficiencies, but to ensure that the board members encountered the most favorable conditions possible. These preparations, though temporary, contributed to the board's perception of the sanatorium as a place where order and efficiency were constant. The diaries simply recorded the extra work involved, offering a parallel view of how such impressions were managed. By the close of the decade, these various irregularities had become an accepted part of institutional life. They did not challenge the overall stability of St. Mary's Sanatorium, nor did they undermine its public reputation. Instead, they formed an unspoken layer of adaptation and improvisation, visible only to those who lived and worked within the building each day. The official records told a story of consistent, measured progress. The diaries, in contrast, revealed the smaller adjustments and unseen efforts that made that story possible. The diaries that would one day emerge from St. Mary's Sanatorium were not written with the intention of being shared. Each was the work of an individual recording details for personal reflection or practical memory. Their entries varied in tone, ranging from brief notes on the day's weather to longer observations about the workings of the institution. While the official records conveyed a single unified account, these private writings captured multiple perspectives, each shaped by the writer's position and daily responsibilities. One of the most detailed sets of entries came from a clerk assigned to the administrative wing during the mid-1890s. His handwriting was precise, his dates meticulously noted, and his descriptions focused largely on the flow of documents and supplies. He recorded the number of letters received in a given week, the tone of the superintendent's dictated replies, and the contents of ledger entries before they were transcribed into the permanent record. In several places, he noted variations between the original notes and the final versions kept for the archive. These changes were never presented as errors or corrections, but simply as the result of refining language to match the institution's preferred style. Another diary belonged to a nurse in the East Wing whose entries were more varied in content. While she noted the daily ward schedules and patient routines, she also included comments on the interaction between different staff departments. She recorded when the kitchen staff substituted a planned dish, when laundry schedules shifted unexpectedly, and when supply deliveries arrived earlier or later than anticipated. These details, while minor, offered a different sense of how the institution operated compared to the smooth consistency implied by the monthly reports. A third diary, less structured but equally revealing, came from a maintenance worker. His notes, often written in pencil on small pages, described repairs completed between official service calls. He documented which tools were borrowed from the storage shed, which rooms required urgent attention, and when improvised solutions were needed due to lack of specific materials. The official maintenance records, by contrast, listed only completed tasks approved in advance, with no mention of the smaller, improvised fixes that kept the building functioning. The process by which these diaries were eventually gathered into a single collection remains unclear. None of the original authors appear to have coordinated with one another, and their writing spans different years within the sanatorium's first decade. The most likely explanation, based on later accounts, is that personal effects left behind by staff were stored together in one of the unused rooms of the staff quarters. When the institution reorganized its living arrangements, these stored items were relocated without inventory, eventually merging into a collection of forgotten belongings. The content of the diaries began to take on greater significance when read alongside one another. For example, the clerk's notes about a delivery of coal in late January 1896 align with the nurse's observation of the same delivery arriving later than planned, and with the maintenance worker's record of adjusting the heating schedule for the West Wing that same week. Each diary recorded the event from a different vantage point, and while none of the entries suggested a problem, together they painted a more complex picture of how a single delay could ripple through the institution's routines. Certain patterns appeared repeatedly across the diaries. Adjustments to scheduled activities, substitutions in the kitchen, and shifts in staffing assignments were all noted by more than one writer. None of these adjustments were presented as disruptive, but their recurrence suggested that flexibility played a greater role in daily operations than the official documents revealed. Where the public image emphasized strict adherence to a fixed plan, the diaries suggested that adaptability was equally essential. The tone of these writings was notably measured. There were no accusations, no sensational claims, and no attempts to contradict the institution's mission. Instead, the diaries conveyed a steady record of practical realities. One entry might note that a lecture in the assembly room was postponed due to an unexpected visitor. Another that a delivery from the market included a different variety of vegetable than ordered. These small variations were the kind of details that rarely appeared in official summaries, but shaped the lived experience of the sanatorium's operation. From a historical perspective, the most revealing aspect of the diaries was how they captured the intersection of the institution's formal structure with the informal adjustments made by staff. The superintendent's authority, the trustees' oversight, and the public's perception were all supported by an underlying system of quiet problem-solving. This system relied on the attentiveness of staff in every department, from the clerk ensuring that correspondence was answered promptly to the groundskeeper replacing damaged plants without delay. In some cases, the diaries indirectly highlighted the differences between policy and practice. For example, official policy might dictate that all supply orders be approved a week in advance. In reality, if an urgent need arose, staff found ways to obtain what was necessary through personal connections in town or by reallocating items from less pressing uses. These actions were not recorded in the ledgers because they did not follow the established procurement process, yet they were essential in maintaining uninterrupted service. The diaries also shed light on how information moved within the sanatorium. While formal communication followed a defined chain of command, informal exchanges often bridged departments more quickly. A nurse might mention a shortage of linens directly to someone in the laundry room, rather than sending an official request through the head nurse. A maintenance worker might alert the kitchen to a planned repair in the pantry, without involving the superintendent's office. These unrecorded conversations allowed the institution to adapt swiftly, though they left no trace in the official archives. Another recurring feature of the diaries was the attention given to seasonal shifts. Winter entries frequently described the challenge of managing heating and ensuring that entryways remained clear of snow. Spring entries focused on preparing the gardens, noting the timing of plantings and the condition of the soil. Summer brought increased interaction with the community during garden tours, while autumn was marked by preparations for colder weather and securing supplies before the frost. These observations reinforced the idea that much of the sanatorium's work was shaped by the rhythms of the natural environment as much as by the schedules set by its administration. In retrospect, the value of the diaries lies in their ability to present a multi-layered view of the same institution. They did not contradict the official records, but expanded upon them, filling in the spaces between planned events and recorded outcomes. For those seeking to understand how St. Mary's Sanatorium functioned in its early years, these writings offer a direct connection to the experiences of those who maintained its daily operations. Through them, the history of the institution becomes less a single polished narrative and more a collection of interwoven accounts, each contributing to a fuller understanding of the whole. Among the most detailed of the surviving diaries was one kept by a junior attendant who began work at the sanatorium in 1894. Her entries, though modest in tone, traced her gradual understanding of how the institution truly operated. She began with straightforward notations of her daily assignments, which included assisting in meal service, preparing rooms, and escorting patients to scheduled activities. Over time, she began to note the ways in which schedules shifted in response to practical needs. For example, a morning gardening session might be moved indoors if the weather turned unexpectedly, or a lecture might be shortened so that the assembly room could be prepared for a visiting group. Her diary also paid attention to the subtle differences between official announcements and actual practice. She recorded an instance in which the dining hall menu listed a particular soup, yet the kitchen served a different variety entirely due to the late arrival of a shipment. The change was made seamlessly, and most of those present never noticed. However, in the official record for that week, the original menu item remained listed as if it had been served as planned. To the attendant, this was not a matter of dishonesty, but an example of how the written record tended to preserve the intended plan rather than the lived reality. The diaries also revealed the quiet cooperation that often occurred across different departments without formal acknowledgement. One entry described how the laundry staff, noticing that a certain ward's linens were wearing thin, arranged for replacements from another area before the official requisition process was completed. In another instance, the maintenance team completed a set of minor repairs in the kitchen during a lull in activity, even though the work had not yet been assigned on the repair schedule. These acts, small and unrecorded, ensured that the institution continued to operate without visible interruption. A pattern found in several diaries was the consistent attention to supply management. Staff in various roles noticed when deliveries contained substitutions, when quantities varied slightly from the order, or when items were omitted entirely. In most cases, the affected department adapted immediately, using what was available rather than delaying work. This adaptability was rarely documented in official reports, yet it was a significant part of how the institution functioned smoothly despite occasional disruptions in supply. The groundskeeper's diary offered further evidence of such adaptability. In one season, a portion of the garden's early crop failed due to an unexpected cold spell. The loss was not entered in the formal garden records, which continued to list the planned output. Instead, the groundskeeper purchased replacement plants from a local grower and worked with a few staff volunteers to restore the plots. This action was completed before the next public garden tour, allowing the institution to present an unbroken image of productivity. One of the most telling details in the diaries concerned the handling of visiting groups. When civic organizations or donors toured the facility, the routes taken through the building were carefully selected. The diaries describe how, in advance of these visits, certain areas received extra attention. Windows cleaned more thoroughly, furniture polished, and decorative plants arranged. These preparations ensured that visitors encountered an environment entirely consistent with the institution's reputation. The diaries do not frame this as an attempt to mislead, but as a necessary part of presenting the sanatorium to the community in its best light. Other entries captured moments of small-scale problem-solving that rarely reached the administrative level. A nurse might secure a needed piece of equipment from a neighboring ward rather than submit a formal request and wait for approval. An attendant might rearrange the seating in a recreation room to make it easier for staff to move between tables during a busier-than-expected activity session. Such adjustments were simple in execution, but contributed significantly to maintaining order and efficiency. Seasonal preparations provided further examples of quiet, undocumented work. In autumn, for instance, the maintenance team ensured that window frames were inspected and any gaps sealed to keep out drafts. While official records marked only the repairs requiring new materials, much of this work involved repurposing supplies already on hand. In winter, additional rugs were placed in certain corridors to reduce chill, a detail noted in one diary but absent from the formal reports. Communication between long-serving staff often took place outside scheduled meetings. Diaries refer to brief conversations in corridors, shared meals in the staff quarters, and exchanges in the garden that allowed for the quick resolution of minor issues. These interactions, while informal, were an essential element of the institution's internal efficiency. The absence of such exchanges from the official archive meant that anyone reviewing the records later might assume a far more rigid and hierarchical flow of communication than actually existed. The most striking common thread across the diaries was the absence of dramatic events. Instead, the emphasis was on steady observation, on the interplay between planned procedure and responsive adjustment. The entries collectively suggested that the success of the sanatorium's public image depended less on unbending adherence to schedule than on the willingness of its staff to make countless small, unrecorded decisions each day. In this way, the diaries provided a parallel history, one that ran alongside the official version without directly opposing it, yet revealed layers of the institution's operation that would otherwise have been invisible. When the diaries were eventually uncovered, they were not immediately recognized as significant historical material. They emerged from a storage room in the former staff quarters, discovered during a period when unused spaces in the building were being cleared of old furniture and documents. The items found there were varied: worn uniforms, a small collection of kitchen utensils, and several wooden boxes containing loose papers. Among these papers were the handwritten journals, some bound in cloth covers, others simple stacks of folded sheets tied with string. Their condition suggested they had been left undisturbed for many years. Dust covered the boxes, and the ink on some pages had faded to a soft brown. Yet the writing was still legible, and the dates marked at the top of each entry provided a clear span of years. At the time of discovery, the building was no longer operating in its original capacity. and the recovery of old records was seen primarily as an opportunity to preserve local history. The diaries were placed in the care of individuals involved in cataloguing the sanatorium's surviving materials, alongside the official ledgers, correspondence, and printed pamphlets. The first person to examine the diaries in detail noted that they differed sharply from the other materials in the collection. The official records were uniform in tone and format, presenting the institution's activities in a consistent style. The diaries, in contrast, varied in handwriting, length of entry, and focus. Some contained meticulous daily notes, while others had irregular gaps between entries. The variation was a reflection of the different roles and personalities of the writers. Initial readings revealed that the diaries contained information not present in the public record. While the ledgers documented supply deliveries, the diaries mentioned the circumstances of their arrival and the adjustments made when schedules shifted. Where official reports listed activities by date and type, the diaries described how those activities were prepared for, modified, or adapted to changing conditions. This qualitative detail provided a more nuanced view of the institution's inner workings. Local historians who became involved in reviewing the diaries were struck by the absence of dramatic revelations. Instead, the value lay in the accumulation of small, consistent observations. These formed a parallel account that complemented the official version without contradicting its essential facts. The diaries demonstrated that the stability for which the sanatorium was known depended as much on unrecorded adaptations as on formal planning. The process of organizing the diaries for preservation involved matching entries from different authors to overlapping time periods. In doing so, patterns became more apparent. For example, an entry from the groundskeeper about replanting garden plots aligned with a nurse's note about receiving fresh produce earlier than expected that same week. Similarly, a maintenance worker's entry about repairing a window matched with a clerk's notation that a delivery had been delayed due to weather, explaining why certain repairs had been prioritized. As the diaries were transcribed, they began to offer a layered perspective on institutional life. Each author contributed a fragment of the larger picture. The clerk's precision with dates and figures provided a framework for understanding the timing of events. The nurse's records illustrated the flexibility required in patient care and daily scheduling. The maintenance staff's notes showed how the physical environment was kept functional through a combination of planned and improvised work. Together, these perspectives created a more complete account of the sanatorium's operations than either the diaries or the official records could provide alone. Public interest in the diaries developed slowly. At first, they were mentioned only in small local newsletters devoted to historical preservation. Later, excerpts began to appear in articles examining the history of healthcare institutions in the region. These articles emphasized how the diaries offered a view of life behind the formal presentations made to the public and to oversight bodies. They also noted how such records, though informal, could be invaluable for understanding how institutions adapted to the realities of daily management. One recurring point in discussions about the diaries was their understated tone. Readers expecting personal narratives marked by strong emotion instead encountered calm, factual accounts. This quality reinforced their reliability as sources, as the entries were not written for an audience and appeared free of deliberate embellishment. In this way, the diaries stood as both personal records and inadvertent institutional documents. Efforts to interpret the diaries within the broader context of the sanatorium's history highlighted how public image was maintained. Official reports gave the impression of seamless operation, while the diaries revealed the quiet, continuous effort required to sustain that image. They showed that small decisions made daily by staff in all departments were as crucial to the institution's success as any formal directive issued from the superintendent's office. By placing the diaries alongside the official archives, historians were able to reconstruct specific sequences of events with greater accuracy. This comparison revealed that while official records rarely acknowledged deviations from planned schedules, such deviations were common and often necessary. The diaries documented these changes without judgment, presenting them simply as part of the rhythm of institutional life. The eventual recognition of the diaries as a significant historical resource was due in part to the clarity with which they conveyed the ordinary. They did not contain dramatic incidents or hidden controversies. Instead, they captured the process by which a large, structured institution functioned over time, responding to both anticipated and unforeseen circumstances. This unfiltered view provided a rare insight into the human and logistical elements behind a carefully maintained public reputation. As study of the diaries continued, researchers began to notice that their significance extended beyond the boundaries of St. Mary Sanatorium itself. They reflected the broader patterns of institutional management common to the late 19th century, especially in facilities that balanced medical care, community engagement, and financial oversight. The diaries served as a reminder that the success of such institutions relied on an often invisible foundation of practical decision-making. Some entries provided rare documentation of specific working relationships within the sanatorium. For example, the notes of one nurse frequently referenced brief but effective collaborations with the maintenance team, particularly when changes to the ward environment were needed. A single entry might mention that a window was adjusted to improve ventilation or that a screen was fitted to reduce drafts. These tasks, simple in themselves, were part of a constant process of fine-tuning that kept the environment comfortable and functional. The diaries also captured the seasonal rhythm of the institution in sharper detail than the official records. In summer, preparations for community visits were given heightened attention, with garden beds refreshed and walkways swept more often. In winter, the attention shifted to heating efficiency and ensuring that storerooms were stocked with supplies that might become scarce during storms. Such cycles were expected, yet the diaries recorded the precise timing and practical adjustments that allowed the sanatorium to meet them without interruption. One important feature of the diaries was their ability to reveal the scope of staff initiative. While the public image of the institution emphasized a top-down structure, the diaries made it clear that many day-to-day improvements originated from the staff themselves. A kitchen worker might test a new arrangement for storing perishable goods, or an attendant might devise a more efficient route for delivering fresh linens. These innovations were often adopted quietly into routine, without ever appearing in official directives. In combining different perspectives, the diaries provided a sense of how interconnected the departments were. An entry from a clerk noting a delayed delivery would often correspond to a kitchen note about a menu change and a maintenance note about a temporary equipment adjustment. The official records, designed for concise reporting, rarely captured these links. By contrast, the diaries preserved them in real time, showing how the institution adapted as a whole to even minor disruptions. The careful preservation of these writings eventually led to their inclusion in regional archives, where they were catalogued with other historical materials from Salem. There they became a point of reference for scholars examining the operation of similar facilities across New England during the same period. The combination of official and unofficial accounts offered a balanced portrayal of institutional life, one that was neither idealized nor critical, but grounded in the practical realities of management and care. Local exhibits occasionally featured selected excerpts, chosen for their ability to illustrate the sanatorium's daily rhythm. Visitors could read side-by-side displays of an official monthly report and a diary entry from the same week, revealing subtle but telling differences in focus. In one example, the official report noted that the gardens had been maintained in good condition, while the diary recorded the exact number of hours spent replanting after an unexpected frost. Both statements were accurate, but the diary provided a level of specificity that added depth to the understanding of events. The process of interpreting the diaries also prompted discussions about the importance of preserving informal records. Many institutions of the era left behind only their official documents, which offered a polished narrative of their operations. The diaries of St. Mary Sanatorium demonstrated the value of retaining materials that reflected the experiences of individuals at all levels of the organization. They showed that even modest factual notes could serve as essential historical evidence when viewed in aggregate. In academic settings, the diaries were used as teaching materials to illustrate how multiple sources can be combined to form a more complete historical account. Students comparing the diaries to the official records learn to identify the kinds of details that are often omitted from formal documentation. This exercise reinforced the idea that history is not only shaped by major events, but also by the accumulation of everyday decisions and actions. The final archival arrangement of the diaries placed them in chronological order, with each entry identified by its original author when known. Cross-references to related official documents were added, allowing researchers to follow events through both types of records. This system made it possible to trace how a small unplanned change in one department might influence schedules or resource use in others, offering a clear picture of the institution's operational dynamics. By the time they were fully studied, the diaries had shifted from being an overlooked collection of personal notes to a recognized source of historical insight. They revealed that the enduring reputation of St. Mary Sanatorium was not solely the product of policy or leadership, but equally of the continuous, often unseen work of those who maintained it day after day. In doing so, they ensured that the quieter aspects of its history would not be lost. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story was taken from documents that were found. All names have been edited to protect the source.